The morning of July 25, 1944, is filled with the eerie stillness of a battlefield on the brink of change. Over the fields of Normandy, the first light of dawn casts long shadows across the war-torn landscape, where the aftermath of D-Day still lingers. The air is thick with the scent of smoke, and the distant rumble of artillery fire reverberates across the horizon. The war is far from over, and the Allies, having stormed the beaches a month earlier, are locked in a brutal struggle with Nazi forces, inching forward with every bloody step. But on this day, something extraordinary is about to happen, a moment that will forever alter the course of the conflict. The war in Europe has been raging for nearly 5 years, leaving a continent in ruins. Adolf Hitler's Third Reich has cast its dark shadow over much of Europe, with millions of lives lost to the violence of the Axis powers. The world is divided, those who fight for freedom against the fascism of the Nazis, and those who are under the oppressive rule of the Axis. The Allies, made up of nations such as the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union, are steadily pushing back against Nazi occupation. Yet, despite the successes of the Allies in North Africa, Italy, and other parts of Europe, the war is far from decided. In fact, the outcome of the war will still depend on a few key battles and decisions. And it's in this moment, on the front lines of Normandy, that history will be made. As the Allies fight their way through France, the Germans are digging in, fortifying their positions along the Western Front. Their defenses are impressive, but the tide of war has begun to turn. The Germans, overwhelmed by the vastness of the enemy forces, have already started to feel the weight of the losses from the Eastern Front and the relentless pressure of the Allied assault from the West. The cracks in their defenses are becoming more evident, but their morale remains high, or at least it seems so from the outside. But on this battlefield, the Nazi generals, in their hubris, are about to face a challenge they could never have foreseen. At the same time, far away from the beaches of Normandy, thousands of miles from their homes, another group of soldiers is preparing to make their way to the front lines. These men, the black soldiers of the United States Army, have been largely overlooked by history up until this point. Segregated, underappreciated, and denied the full rights and recognition they deserve, these soldiers are not simply fighting to win a war. They are fighting for something deeper, something more personal. They are fighting for their dignity, their humanity, and their place in a country that has repeatedly denied them equality. The fight against the Axis powers has taken on a different significance for these men, who have been systematically segregated from their white counterparts, relegated to lesser roles and given fewer resources. But today, the black soldiers of the United States Army, many of them members of the storied 92nd Infantry Division, also known as the Buffalo Soldiers, are about to prove that they are just as capable, just as fierce, and just as determined as any of their counterparts. These soldiers have been trained for combat, and they have endured years of racial discrimination within their own ranks. Now, as part of the Allied force pushing toward the heart of Nazi-occupied Europe, they are about to face the brutal realities of war. Their courage, however, is already being tested in ways few can comprehend. They are not just fighting an enemy on the battlefield. They are fighting the weight of history itself. The Buffalo Soldiers, a unit that has seen decades of service dating back to the Indian Wars, have long been tasked with the most dangerous assignments. Despite being assigned to segregated units, the men of the 92nd Infantry Division are not unfamiliar with hardship. Their journey through the military has been a fight for respect, recognition, and equality. In 1944, as the Allies gear up for a decisive push into France, these men are ready. They know what's at stake, not just for the war but for their place in history. They are about to show the world that the courage and strength of a soldier are not defined by the color of their skin. The Nazis, however, have underestimated the resolve of these men. In their view, black soldiers were seen as inferior, incapable of facing the brutal realities of modern warfare. This belief, rooted in racial ideology, was a critical flaw in the Nazi mentality. As the war had progressed, the Nazis had already failed to acknowledge the strength of Allied unity and the resilience of soldiers they considered subhuman. For them, the idea of black soldiers fighting in the front lines was unfathomable. But the Nazis were about to learn an important lesson, one that would change their perception of warfare forever. While the Buffalo Soldiers march toward the front, the Germans are preparing for a different kind of battle. In the towns and villages of Normandy, the Allies have already begun to push forward, facing fierce resistance from the entrenched German forces. But despite their defenses, the Nazis are slowly being pushed back. Their control over the region is slipping. The sound of artillery and gunfire fills the air. But there's a sense of anticipation. The world is waiting for the moment that will shift the balance of power. The battle for France has already begun, but it's not just the terrain that's being fought over. It's the very principles of freedom, equality, and justice. The soldiers of the 92nd Infantry Division understand this on a deep, personal level. This is their fight. They're not just advancing on a battlefield in France. They are advancing toward history itself, to prove that their sacrifices, their service, and their courage matter. The generals, the soldiers, and the civilians are all bracing for the decisive moment. The Allies' next move will be one that will change the course of the war, and the world will soon see how a group of overlooked, underappreciated men can rise to the challenge of defeating the most formidable military force the world has ever seen. The sun climbs higher, illuminating the faces of those who stand ready for battle. The black soldiers of the 92nd Infantry Division, once seen as a footnote in the history of the war, will soon be part of a moment that no one will ever forget. They are poised to change everything, to show the world that courage has no color, and that the true strength of a nation lies in the hearts of those who fight for it. The tension of the war is palpable in the summer of 1944. As the Allies continue their relentless push into Nazi-occupied France, there is a growing sense of urgency. The Nazis, once unstoppable, are beginning to buckle under the weight of the Allied assault. For the soldiers of the 92nd Infantry Division, however, the battle has a unique meaning. These black soldiers, who have faced not only the threat of enemy fire but also the societal pressures and racial injustices of their time, are now fighting to prove their worth on the most critical stage of all, the battlefield. The road to Normandy has not been easy for these men. They've spent years preparing for this moment, enduring years of segregation within the military and overcoming the prejudice that often accompanied their service. Despite being placed in segregated units and often relegated to less prestigious roles, these soldiers had proved their courage time and again in training and earlier combat assignments. But the real test was coming, and it was unlike anything they had faced. Before, the 92nd Infantry Division had long been considered one of the most formidable and battle-tested African-American units in the United States Army. Their history was steeped in honor, dating back to their service in the Spanish-American War, World War I, and even the Indian Wars. The soldiers had already earned the nickname Buffalo Soldiers from Native American tribes, a title that symbolized strength and tenacity. Now, as part of the American forces in the European theater, these men were ready to step into their place in history. They were part of the larger Allied strategy to liberate Western Europe from Nazi control. The Allies had already made significant progress in Italy, North Africa, and the Pacific, but the war in Europe was far from over. The D-Day landings on June 6, 1944, had been a turning point, and now the Allies were fighting their way through the rugged terrain of France. The Germans were dug in, fortifying their positions, but the Allies, spurred on by the successes of the past, were moving forward with renewed determination. The Normandy invasion, though a success, was just the beginning. The real challenge lay ahead. The soldiers of the 92nd Division were stationed in the heart of the Allied advance, right at the edge of some of the fiercest combat of the war. They faced an enemy that had entrenched itself deeply in the region, well-armed and well-organized. The Germans were determined to hold their ground, believing that the outcome of the war was still within their grasp. But they underestimated the determination of the soldiers they were facing. In preparation for the assault, the soldiers of the 92nd Division trained relentlessly. Their mission was not just to fight, but to win, and to prove that their place in the military was as legitimate as any other. The military leadership understood that these soldiers carried with them not just the weight of the battle, but the weight of history. Every success, every step forward, was a chance to prove that race had no bearing on a soldier's bravery. But despite the recognition of their potential, they faced their own struggles within the ranks. They were subjected to segregation, with black soldiers often assigned to less prestigious roles or placed in combat units that were sent to the front lines with little support. Despite the obstacles, they pushed forward. Their training was rigorous, their resolve unshakable. These men had faced more than just the physical trials of training. They had also had to confront the emotional toll of being excluded from the mainstream narrative of the war. They fought not just for victory, but for their dignity, for the right to stand side by side with their white counterparts and prove that they were just as capable of taking on the Nazi war machine. By July 1944, the Buffalo Soldiers had become a key part of the Allied strategy. Their mission was not just to secure land or defeat the enemy. They were also charged with proving a much larger point, that the United States, a country that had long denied them their rights, could no longer ignore the contributions of African Americans in this fight. Their presence at the front lines was a powerful message, one that would resonate far beyond the battlefields of Europe. The terrain they would face in France was brutal. The lush green fields that once symbolized life and hope were now marred by the scars of war. The ground was littered with debris, and the remnants of previous battles left the area nearly unrecognizable. The soldiers of the 92nd Division were familiar with adversity, but nothing could have prepared them for the sheer intensity of the fight ahead. The Germans, entrenched in their positions, had every advantage in terms of fortifications, weaponry, and experience. But the Allies had the one thing that could not be calculated: resolve. As the soldiers of the 92nd Division made their way toward the front, they knew that this battle would be their defining moment. The outcome of the war was still uncertain, but these men were about to prove that their courage could no longer be ignored. The battlefield would be their proving ground, and the world would soon see that the fight for justice and equality was just as important as the fight against tyranny. While the military planners understood the gravity of the situation, they also knew that the involvement of the Buffalo Soldiers would have significant consequences beyond the battlefield. These men, despite facing racial discrimination at home and in the ranks, were about to show the world that no force, whether it was the Nazi military or the prejudice of a divided nation, could stand against their courage and determination. The Germans, on the other hand, still viewed the conflict through a lens of racial superiority. They believed that they were the master race, and any enemy, particularly one they perceived as inferior, would eventually fall before them. But as the first shots rang out in Normandy, it became clear that the real test had begun. The soldiers of the 92nd Division were not just fighting for their country, they were fighting for the dignity of every soldier who had been denied a place in history. The Germans, in their blind belief in their racial superiority, had no idea what they were about to face. The battle that would unfold over the coming days would not only test the soldiers of the 92nd Division, but would challenge the very foundations of Nazi ideology. This was no longer just a war of military strategy. It had become a war for the soul of humanity. And in the coming hours, the Buffalo Soldiers would show the world that no matter how great the enemy, no matter how deep the prejudice, true courage cannot be denied. The sun begins its descent over the battlefields of Normandy, casting long, jagged shadows across the landscape. The soldiers of the 92nd Infantry Division, hardened by years of training and scarred by the realities of war, are now moving forward into a brutal new chapter of the conflict. Their advance through the French countryside has been slow and relentless, a march that takes them deeper into the heart of Nazi-occupied territory. Each step is one fraught with danger, and yet they are resolute. They are not just fighting for a military victory. They are fighting for the honor of a people, a cause that transcends national borders or racial divides. The battle is fierce, and the Germans, though facing mounting pressure, are far from surrendering. Their forces have dug in, fortifying positions with tanks, machine guns, and artillery that seem endless. They are determined to repel the invaders, to hold their ground, and to continue the fight for the Third Reich. But there's an unspoken tension in the air, the realization that the end may be near, that the once invincible Wehrmacht is beginning to crack under the pressure. The men of the 92nd Division, though few in number, are among those leading the charge. Their mission is one of utmost importance: to secure a critical position that could open the door for the Allies to advance even further into France and eventually into Germany itself. But the terrain is unforgiving, and the enemy is relentless. There are no guarantees. Each moment spent on the battlefield is another moment where their courage is put to the test. It is here, in the heart of battle, that the soldiers of the 92nd Division show their true mettle. The Germans, who had long held the belief that black soldiers were inferior, now face a terrifying reality. These soldiers are just as capable, just as fierce, and perhaps even more determined than the enemy they fight. The battlefield becomes a proving ground not just for military tactics, but for the soldiers themselves. Every bullet fired, every foot gained, is a testament to their strength, to their resilience, and to their ability to rise above the challenges they have faced their entire lives. The battle rages on, but the tide is shifting. The Allies, with their superior numbers, technological advancements, and unyielding resolve, are beginning to make headway. The Germans, already stretched thin on multiple fronts, are losing ground. As the days pass, the soldiers of the 92nd Division continue to push forward, their success marking a critical point in the larger Allied strategy. With each small victory, they begin to take control of key points, strategically important locations that, once in Allied hands, will allow for the eventual liberation of Paris and the collapse of Nazi control over France. But it is not just the physical terrain that is being won in this battle. It is the psychological warfare that matters as well. The Germans, who had once believed themselves to be the superior race, are forced to reckon with the unthinkable, the might of an army led by men they considered subhuman. The soldiers of the 92nd Division, in their determination and their bravery, have shattered the Nazi perception of racial superiority, proving that valor and courage are not limited by the color of one's skin. As the Buffalo Soldiers press forward, each victory becomes a symbolic blow to the ideology that had fueled the war. An ideology based on hate, fear, and division. In the heat of the combat, soldiers from both sides are pushed to their limits. The air is thick with smoke and the acrid scent of burning metal and flesh. The sounds of machine gun fire, mortar blasts, and the shrill whistle of artillery shells fill the air. It's a constant barrage of noise, disorientation, and destruction. The soldiers of the 92nd Division, however, move through it with a singular purpose. For them, this is not just another fight in a long series of battles. This is their moment, their chance to prove that they belong, that their sacrifices matter. And then, in a key moment during the battle, the breakthrough comes. The 92nd Division, after days of fierce combat, manages to capture a heavily fortified German position. The success is immediate and decisive. The Allied forces, now bolstered by the Buffalo Soldiers' efforts, surge forward, and the Germans are forced to retreat. The battlefield, once filled with the sounds of desperate fighting, grows quieter, the roar of conflict slowly fading into the distance. The soldiers of the 92nd Division, though exhausted and bloodied, stand tall. Their victory is not just military, it is moral. They have proven their worth, not just to their comrades, but to the world. The victory at Normandy becomes a turning point, not just in the war, but in the way the world views these soldiers. The 92nd Division's actions have changed the course of history, and their bravery has shifted the psychological tide of the war. No longer can the Nazis claim to hold the upper hand in terms of racial ideology. The Buffalo Soldiers have proved them wrong, their courage and determination far outpacing the racist beliefs that once defined the enemy. But the victory comes at a cost. The battlefield is littered with the bodies of the fallen, and the soldiers of the 92nd Division mourn their comrades who have given everything for the cause. The price of victory is steep, and for many the toll of war is immeasurable. The battle has been won, but it is not the end. The war will continue and the challenges will only grow. But for the soldiers of the 92nd Division, this victory, and the knowledge that they have proven their worth, will remain etched in their hearts forever. Their courage has altered the course of the war, and in doing so, they have proven that the fight for justice and equality is as crucial as the fight against tyranny. Their success on the battlefield has shattered the myths of Nazi superiority, and it has shown the world that there is no limit to what a determined soldier can achieve, regardless of race, background, or circumstance.